This section of the Veripax University series will hopefully take some of the mystery out of structured notes. I'm Jerry Verseput, and one of my roles is Chief Investment Officer of Veripax Wealth Management. I believe that structured notes can be very effective for reducing risk and making returns more predictable, and yet the financial industry is full of misinformation or outdated information about these notes, at least on the retail side of investing. Structured notes are used extensively in the institutional side of investing, which would include things like pension funds and college endowments. So hopefully this will just remove some of the mystery around these things. Let's get this disclaimer out of the way. There's nothing in this presentation that should be considered investment advice. It's for informational and educational purposes only. To get this started, let's talk about what a structured note is. And some people might be a little more familiar with bonds, which are just loans that you would make to a bank or some other company in exchange for interest. Let's say that we bought a bond from JP Morgan Bank. When we buy that bond, we're taking on some credit risk, which is the risk that when the bond expires, that the bank won't be able to pay us our money back. In exchange for that risk, the bank is going to pay us some interest or a yield. And in this example, we've got a 5-year bond and it's paying today probably a 3% yield. The question is that good enough? And for most people's retirement accounts, it's probably not. In order to entice a few more people to lend the bank money, the banks are constantly looking for more sources of cash and liquidity. The bank will combine this bond with a financial structure. They'll take that interest and use it to help finance this structure. Inside that structure, the bank might also sell some stock options, buy stock options, trade futures contracts, use whatever financial vehicles are available to the bank in order to make the return more enticing or more interesting. Inside that financial structure, because it's using typically stock options, it will take on a little bit of market risk. So there is a different form of risk in a structured note. And when these two are packaged together, it's called a structured note. And now in this example, it would allow the bank to pay us a significantly higher interest rate. And one of the examples of a note in my practice would be a 5-year note and paying 9.5% yield. The reason why this is called a structured note instead of a structured bond is that inside of these products is actually a senior note instead of a bond. And the difference is that a senior note is higher on the credit structure. If something were to happen to the bank and they can't pay all of their creditors their money back, structured note holders would get paid first, and then the bond holders would get paid later. Another way to think of structured notes is relative to a typical stock and bond portfolio. In a typical portfolio, we're taking market risk on the stock side and credit risk on the bond side. In a structured note, then, we're simply taking both of these risks that already exist in a portfolio and putting them into a single product. When we do that, we're actually taking a little bit less credit risk, because as we just talked about, what's inside of here is actually a senior note. On the market side, we're actually taking a little bit less market risk than simply owning stocks, because within that hedging structure or that financial structure, there's typically a high safety margin. However, when you combine both of these risks into a single product, you get this multiplying effect on the benefit. And that'll take the form of either a significantly higher interest rate in the case of an income-oriented note, or sometimes, if it's put together differently, you might get better stock participation, but with high safety margin. And one of the criticisms of notes for people who either aren't real clear on how they work or how to use them in a portfolio is that they're risky. And yet when you take a look at them relative to the risks that we're already taking in a portfolio, they often will be less risky than some of the risks that we're already taking. Well, now that we know what a structured note is, let's take a look at a couple of examples. And this first one is an example of an income-oriented note. It's called a contingency note. In this case, the note is going to pay us interest, but that interest is going to be contingent on a certain condition. This is an actual note in my practice. It's a 5-year note. The underlying stock index is the Russell 2000, and it's paying an interest rate of 9.5%. Payments are each quarter. On the day that this note is issued, they'll take a snapshot of the Russell 2000. And let's say the Russell 2000 is at a level of 1600. The note will then contain two types of barriers. The interest rate barrier will be set at 70% of that original value. So as long as the Russell 2000 stays above 1120, the note will continue to pay its interest rate. And then at the end of year 5, at expiration day, they'll take a look at the principal barrier to see if we get all of our money back. And as long as it's above its 60% level, which would be in this case 960, as long as the Russell 2000 is above 960, then we get all of our principal back. So let's see how this would work. I'm going to put up here for reference a typical corporate bond today, which would be paying about 3.6%. We purchase this note, we wait for a quarter, and then the note will take a look at the Russell 2000 to see if it's above the interest rate barrier. In this example, this is one I bought in 2018, and 3 months later, the Russell 2000 was actually a little bit higher. So obviously it's above its interest rate barrier and it paid its quarterly interest rate. And now notice we have a little bit more safety margin. 3 months later, we were at the depths of a fairly significant stock pullback. So now the Russell 2000 has lost quite a bit of value, and yet it's still significantly higher than our interest rate barrier. We still have a 22.7% safety margin, and so it pays another quarterly interest payment. And let's say that this just continued on for a while. After 1 year, we would have made our 9.5%. After 2 years, we would make 19%. Now let's say 2.5 years into this note, we run into some problems. And the Russell 2000 actually falls below the interest rate barrier. Now what happens? Well, that means we miss a quarterly payment. Hypothetically, 90 days later, when it pays its next quarterly payment, takes another look. And in this case, let's say it just creeped up back above the interest rate barrier. As long as it's at that barrier or above, it will pay its quarterly interest. And so now we get our interest payment. And let's say this continues on for the rest of the note, paying us our 9.5% yield. So we simply missed one payment in this case. At the end of year 5, when this is ready to expire, we no longer care about the interest rate barrier. So now we're only looking at the principal barrier. The note will take a look at it and say, is it above that 960 level? And if so, then we get all of our principal back. If it was lower than that principal barrier, which would mean that over that entire 5-year time frame, the Russell 2000 must have fallen more than 40%, then our principal loss would be the exact same as if we had owned a Russell 2000 index fund. So the risk is never worse than owning the underlying index. In this case, we can see that the Russell 2000 is actually quite a bit lower than it was 5 years before when the note was issued, but because it's still well above that principal barrier, we get all of our principal back, and we earned a significantly higher rate of interest in the meantime. Structured notes can be a great source of income for relatively modest risk, but another use of structured notes is what I would call as a stock replacement. And these are growth-oriented notes. This is an example of a note that I've used in the past. It was a 5-year note, and the underlying index was the S&P 500. I'm going to draw in the risk profile of just simply owning an S&P 500 index fund, and this is the risk profile of pretty much any mutual fund that would be in a portfolio. If stocks go up, we make money, and if stocks go down, we lose money. In the case of this note, if the S&P 500 is higher after 5 years, the note returns 1.5 times the return of the S&P 500. So if the S&P was up 60%, this note would pay 90%. What happens though if after 5 years the S&P 500 is lower? Well, in that case, if it's anywhere from 0% down to minus 50%, the note gives you all of your money back. So it's got a 50% safety barrier. Now, if the S&P was even lower than 50% after 5 years, then, unfortunately, we would have the same principal loss as if we had owned the index fund, and we would be sad. But it is a stock replacement, so there is risk on the downside. Another downside is that we give up the dividend. So if after 5 years the market was pretty much flat, well, we may have been better off simply owning the index and taking the dividend. It doesn't take much movement on the downside, though, before we're really happy to just get our money back, and it doesn't take much movement on the upside where that 1.5 times leverage more than makes up for the dividend. Another downside of these structured notes is that this risk profile I'm showing is only fully visible on the day of expiration. And each day that the note matures or gets closer to expiration, it gets a little bit closer to that profile. But at the very beginning, if the market were to suddenly rocket higher a week after buying this note, the note probably wouldn't keep up with the market right away. They also have a tendency, though, to actually track the market on the way down, again, when the note is young. So this would be a type of an investment where you buy it and then you don't even look at it for the next 4.5 years. But overall, you can see that I think the risk profile is much better than simply owning the underlying index. I want to show one more example of a growth note. It's called a digital return note. This is one that I really like to use in my practice. This particular one is based on the S&P 500 and the Russell 2000, and it's going to take a look at which one of these two indices is performing the worst. So taken together, it pretty much represents the US market. And the duration of the note is 6 years. So I've got the profit graph of pretty much any mutual fund that might be in a portfolio here. In the case of this note, if after 6 years, these two indices are anywhere between positive 45% and minus 30%, if they end up anywhere within this range, then the note will pay 45%. If the market actually is higher than 45%, and that represents a 7.5% return per year. If it's higher than that, well, then the note will just go up 1 for 1 with whichever one of these indices is the lower one. But 100% participation with no limit. If the US market ended up being more than 30% lower after 6 years, then we would experience a loss. But in this case, we have a 30% buffer. That means that if the market was down 31%, the loss on this note would only be about 1%. And I've got a couple of examples here. If stocks were up 50%, the note would pay 50%. If stocks were down 20% at the end of 6 years, this note would pay its digital return of positive 45. The reason I like this note is because even if the market is flat, it continues to make progress towards clients' financial goals. And ultimately, that's the objective. To finish this off, I want to address a question that I get quite often, which is, if these are so wonderful, why doesn't everyone use them? And there's some specific answers to that. Structured notes are more of an institutional style of investment, and those get used a lot in pension funds or college endowments, so you don't see them as much on the retail side of the investment world. Pensions and endowments have very specific requirements in terms of how much they need to distribute each year, as well as their growth requirements. And structured notes tend to sacrifice sometimes the unlimited upside of stocks in favor of a more predictable return with lower risk. And that's very conducive to pensions and endowments. I would also say that's more conducive to people's retirement accounts. But sometimes people are unwilling to give up that sense of rolling the dice with stocks and seeing how stocks turn out. They also tend to simply be more complex than stocks or bonds, and that makes some advisors nervous. In fact, sometimes you need a YouTube video to describe how these things work. Finally, there was a time, particularly 10, 15 years ago, when salespeople tended to forget to mention the risks. So these are not riskless investments. They just simply give us the ability to control those risks more than simply owning stocks and bonds. I like to think of structured notes as allowing me to use risk almost like chess pieces. I can put risk right where I want it in order to hopefully get the outcome, or at least a more predictable outcome than I would otherwise be able to get. That does it for our session on structured notes. Thank you very much for listening.